Trains have appeared in many films throughout the years as everything from the setting of the story to being part of a greater action set piece. As cool as these scenes are, not all of these engines are true to real life, and that gets on my nerves. So today, we're going to take a look at everything wrong with the trains in Before we look at the trains, let's first look at the context. Set in 1980s Alaska, we start in a matte painting of a high-security prison. Having been welded into a solitary confinement cell by the sadistic prison warden Rankin for 3 years after multiple escape attempts, notorious bank robber and hardened criminal Oscar Manny Mannheim is allowed out of his cell by means of a court order. Having become somewhat of a hero among his fellow inmates thanks to his antics, the news causes quite a stir in the prison, and so Warden Rankin is keen to take any opportunity to take Manny out to help re-establish his authority. Only a few moments after leaving solitary, Manny meets up with an old friend and both immediately put plans into place to make a break for freedom. That night, while watching a boxing match, an inmate paid off by Rankin tries to give Manny a London hello, but fails, resulting in a brawl. Realizing the warden has it in for him, Manny decides to move up his escape attempt, but his friend is unable to join him thanks to his injuries. The following night, Manny makes his escape attempt with the aid of a young, wide-eyed, smooth-talking boxer, who sounds like he's taken one too many on the chin.
Hey Manny, take me with you.
Boxer Boy sees his opportunity and joins Manny's escape, offering to help since Manny's hand was injured during the prison fight. The pair slip through a sewer, dive into a river, and trudge their way through the frozen wasteland until they finally reach a rail yard. After stealing some dry clothes, Manny spots a set of engines and they both climb aboard the rear unit, hiding in the cab. Back at the prison, news of Manny's escape has started a riot. Rankin is not only insulted by this being another of Manny's escape attempts, but knows that he'll never be able to control the prisoners while Manny has his freedom. With that, the hunt for the convicts begins. Back at the yard, the convict convoy starts moving when the driver very suddenly dies of a fatal heart attack. He slams on the emergency brake before tumbling off the locomotive, but they're not enough to stop the engines from rapidly speeding up and running away, with the brakes melting off by the time they leave the yard. Control is informed and switches it onto the main line in the hopes they're able to find a way to bring it to a stop. Meanwhile, Man City notices how fast they're going and gives Rocky an Oscar-worthy lecture on the real struggles of life outside of prison. It's not until the Runaway crashes through another train's caboose that the convicts realize they're trapped on an out-of-control train. Figuring the train is unmanned, Control orders for it to be derailed before it reaches an old bridge, only for someone to sound the horn. Hearing that someone alive is on board, the plan to derail it is cancelled and the train speeds on. Turns out that it's the locomotive Hostler that's still on board, having taken a nap in an engine when it began to run away and was awoken by the crash.
How would you like a really good huh?
Who the starts a conversation like that? I just sat down.
She explains that all the controls are routed to the lead engine, and that to stop the train they'd need to get to it, but due to the crash with the caboose, the front door of the second locomotive, an old streamliner, is jammed shut, and as such there's no way to safely get across to the first engine. Hearing this, Man United and $45 Baby figure they'll take their chances and jump, when Hostler suggests that they can slow down the train by disconnecting the control cables between the locomotives, which will cause the engines to shut down. With a plan in place, the team wrap up, grab some tools, and set out to slow down this crazy train. After some close shaves, they manage to disconnect the rear two locomotives and slow down a little bit before arriving in the second engine. News of there being 3 people on board reaches Control, and Rankin figures out that they're his escaped convicts and sets off in pursuit. Back on the train, the team are unable to break open the front door of the streamliner, and with no other way to get to the lead engine, Of Mice and Manny says he'll climb around the front. Little Mac offers to do it instead, but is unable to make it and returns to the cab. Manny tries to force one round back outside and a fight breaks out between the three, ending in tears as all of them finally reach their emotional breaking point. Control meanwhile notices that the train is headed towards a tight bend near a chemical plant, and a derailment would result in a major disaster. As such, they decide to divert the Runaway into a dead-end siding, dooming everyone on board. The trio sit in silence for a while until Rankin flies overhead. A cop tries to climb down from the helicopter to stop the train, only to slip and fall. Seeing this, Manny Gascar springs into life and starts taunting the warden when the train suddenly turns into a siding. Hostler realizes they're heading for a dead end and are going to die, but Rankin's arrival is enough to motivate Manny to try and climb across. He almost falls after making the jump, being dragged and getting his fingers crushed, but makes it to the cab. Rankin follows shortly behind, but Manny gets the drop on him and cuffs him to a pipe. Knowing they're approaching a dead end, Rankin demands Manny stop the engine, but Manny chooses to let the train crash and take both of them with it rather than be recaptured. With that, he steps out of the cab and uncouples the front engine, leaving Boxers and Hostler to watch as he disappears into the distance. Finally, he climbs onto the roof of the speeding engine and embraces his freedom and incoming death. And it's on that note the film ends with a quote from Shakespeare's Richard III. How's that for an ending, Unstoppable, you enigma wrapped in absurdity and deep-fried in cliché? Going in, I thought this movie was going to be a simple, cult classic popcorn action flick, and to an extent it was, but once you peel back the layers, it's a surprisingly deep story with complex characters. Two complex characters to be specific, Manny and Rankin. Not to say that nobody else had any character development, but these two are without question the stars. Manny is not a good person by any means, but he clearly regrets some of his life choices and simply wants to be treated like a human being. Rankin, on the other hand, is a sadistic man who views the people in his care as little more than animals and treats them as such. He doesn't care about making the world a better place, he only wants to punish and control those who he deems are morally below him. There's a running theme of comparing people to animals. Even Rankin, who presents himself as above the people he dehumanizes, goes feral for a moment when he's finally imprisoned himself. You can almost make the connection that the train is a metaphor for Manny. Both escape from the respective facilities that contain them and tear through anything that blocks their path to freedom, both becoming mangled in desperate pursuit of their goal. When it's clear that the powers that be won't allow them to remain free, both end up choosing death over captivity. There's even parallels between the beginning and end. Rankin starts out as free and uses that freedom to mock Manny, who he wishes to see die alone, trapped in a dark cell. But by the end, Rankin is the one trapped and doomed to die in a dark room, while Manny embraces his short but liberating freedom. There's an entire video essay about this movie waiting to happen, but that's not what this video's about. It's about the story of how this movie came to be is almost worthy of multiple videos on its own. In 1962, an accident took place on the New York Central involving 4 EMD GP20s running away. A machinist and a hostler were on board doing a brake check and sorting paperwork when the hostler fell off while the throttle was on full power. The engines began to move, and by the time the machinist, who was in the second locomotive, realized he was the only person aboard, they were already heading out the yard despite the brakes being fully on. Oncoming trains were moved into sidings as the Runaway set off down the main line, with the brakes gradually wearing out, allowing the engines to reach over 90 miles an hour as they went. Eventually, the machinist bravely climbed to the back of his locomotive and disconnected the control cables that connected the locomotives together, causing the rear engines to shut off. When he returned to the cab and saw he was slowing down, he made his way to the front locomotive and flipped every switch he could find until the engine shut off and slowly coasted to a stop. In 1963, writer and director Akira Kurosawa, yes, that Akira Kurosawa, read about the event in Life magazine and wrote a screenplay alongside Hideo Oguni and Ryuzo Kikushima titled Runaway Train based on the incident, with 2 escaped prisoners hiding in the train as it ran out of control. Production, however, stalled and was postponed indefinitely. The script was picked up again in 1982, with Andrei Konchalovsky set to direct and funding coming from Cannon Films. Jon Voight, Eric Roberts and Rebecca De Mornay were brought in for the lead roles and shooting began in 1985. Writer and former convict Edward Bunker helped punch up the screenplay during shooting, primarily writing prison scenes, and even helped his friend and former fellow inmate Danny Trejo get a small role in the film, which in turn started his career. The film was shot in Montana, Alaska and California, and a total of 10 locomotives were acquired for production. The main 4 engines were borrowed from the Alaska Railroad and built by EMD, these being GP40-2 number 3010, F7 number 1500 and 2 GP7s number 1801 and 1810. Exterior shots were filmed across Alaska with these locomotives, with MRS-1 number 1605 appearing as the engine pulling the freight train during the caboose crash scene. The yard scenes were shot in Montana, with production having to use fake snow to cover the yard due to the warm spring they had that year. Exterior shots of the train were also intended to be shot in Montana, but these were filmed in Alaska due to the lack of snow. Engines from the Butte, Anaconda and Pacific Railway had to be borrowed and dressed up as the Alaskan engines for the yard shots, with an EMD F9 standing in for the F7 and GP382 number 109 taking the place of the GP40. All of the GP7s that were used in the film had been rebuilt with smaller short hoods, and so the art department had to attach plywood extensions to them to give them the desired taller look. The Alaska Railroad was very strict when it came to shooting, demanding their logo not be shown on the engines and that everyone was properly fixed to the trains while they were moving, going so far as to hire trained mountaineers to make sure everyone was secured. Several cars were modified for use by the film crew so production could continue in the remote parts of Alaska, with the team building a kitchen car, a dining car, a car specifically for developing film, and sleeping quarters for cast and crew. Some of these cars even appeared in the film as part of the freight train that the Runaway collides with. Sets were built in California for the interior cab scenes, and models were used for a few shots such as the caboose crash. Many of the stunts were done for real, though some of the footage is sped up to make them seem faster and more dangerous. We, however, aren't here to discuss the movie's production. We're here for some mistakes. Before we continue, I just want to thank The Normal Nut for their help with this part. They just emailed me out of the blue asking if I was doing a video on Runaway Train as I was writing this script, and when I said yes, they sent me an 11-page document with a bunch of errors that they found as well as other useful information, so most of the credit for this part can go to them. The first error we get is in the rail yard, with the F unit providing some good old-fashioned disappearing locomotive continuity. When the engine starts, the driver sets the locomotive to full power, which in a yard is a questionable thing to do. But since the reverser is in neutral position, it's clear he's in a tearing hurry to go nowhere. When having a heart attack, the driver wisely pulls the emergency brake. This not only applies the brakes, but would also cut the locomotive's engine, so really the train should have come to a stop fairly quickly. It's likely the writers confused the emergency brake with the independent, as applying that wouldn't cut the engine and would disable the dead man's switch. But I'm also willing to accept that this driver applied both sets of brakes as we see him reach for his controls before it cuts away and cuts back to him. As he falls off, we get a close-up of the driver and see he's somehow on the right side of the engine before it cuts to him falling off the left. While radioing the yard manager, the wagons behind this guy come to a very abrupt stop. As the yard manager watches the convoy leave the yard, a big, red-hot chunk of an engine's brake block flies off, and while it isn't unheard of for this to happen, the fact that the brakes have deteriorated so soon on all of the locomotives raises some worrying questions about what they're making their brake blocks out of. Inside the cab of the rear engine, we see that the roof is angled, however from the outside the roof is shown to be curved. I'm assuming this is meant to be a close-up shot of one of the locomotive's bogies, but it looks too bare bones to me and looks more like a carriage or wagon bogie. I'll give this a couple of dings since the same bogie appears again later in the film. Coming up to the caboose crash, we see a pair of EMDs pulling a long line of hopper cars. It cuts away to a stop signal and cuts back to what is supposed to be the same train, however the train is now made up of a random assortment of cars being pulled by a completely different pair of locomotives. I do appreciate the control guy breaking the old cliche of seeing the runaway train coming though.
I don't see any runaway.
You were close enough to see her, you'd be dead. Get it?
A brief second before impact, we see the caboose actually manages to enter the siding in time, only to jump back a little in the next shot. Some real unstoppable siding shenanigans there. When the crash actually happens, we get a spectacular shot of the caboose coming apart, but the crash almost seems to shove the frame out from beneath the body of the caboose, which doesn't quite seem right to me. Plus, slamming into these last two cars like this wouldn't necessarily cause the runaway to derail, but that kind of impact at that kind of speed would certainly have a good chance of knocking the leading engine off. Also, as the engines pass by, an absurd amount of debris rains down on them from the wagons, including an entire bogie and a large chunk of the car it's still attached to, all landing on the third engine. I don't think I need to tell you that a big chunk of solid steel like that wouldn't just bounce and slide off a locomotive's cab if it landed on it. And something that's very easy to miss is this extra bit on the top of the fourth locomotive's engine bay that isn't there in any of the other shots. When approaching an old wooden bridge, control states that the speed limit for it is 50 miles an hour, but even then that's excessive. For an older bridge like this, a more reasonable speed would be around 30 miles an hour. Upon hearing the engine's horn blowing, everyone in the movie refers to it as a whistle. I don't know if that's just railroad terminology or a scripting error, but that's a horn. To me it is at least. I don't know, someone else is going to correct me in the comments. When the hostler arrives, she explains that the emergency fuel cutoff buttons won't work as, in her words,
All I know is when a bunch of engines are hooked up together, everything operates from the lead engine.
While this is true of the driving controls, things like emergency stop buttons should still work on the individual units. Having them all become disabled and only accessible from the lead engine seems like a very big oversight to me. The hostler also states that by disconnecting the multiple unit cables, the engines would shut down one by one. However, in reality, severing just one of the cables would cause all of the engines in the consist to shut off. A thought I had while watching this is if it was possible to take control of one of the rear units after disconnecting it and either applying the dynamic brake or setting it in reverse to slow the runaway down. I'll accept that none of the characters thought of this however, as the only people on board are two prisoners and the hostler who flat out says she doesn't know much about locomotive operation. Actually, thinking about it, surely one of the other engines would be fitted with a radio they could use to contact HQ and ask them for assistance. I'm not sure where I'm going with this point, let's just add a ding and move on. Back in control, someone states that the runaway has slowed down from 92 to 80 miles an hour. This is quite a remarkable pace considering the top speed of most of these engines is about 70 miles an hour. To achieve that kind of speed, the runaway is either going downhill or the F7 unit is really pulling its weight. An awful lot of beams fall off that bridge as the train passes over it, and yet somehow it's still standing. This shot of the F7 unit raises two questions. Firstly, the hostler mentions that some of the wreckage from the caboose crash had damaged the front door and made it difficult to open. But when we see the front of the engine, there doesn't seem to be a scratch, and I'm fairly certain those doors open inwards anyway, so it should be straightforward to get it open. Secondly, why does this engine have a snowplow while the lead engine doesn't? I get that not every locomotive needs one, but you'd think that the lead engine on a train passing through Alaska in the middle of winter would have something to deal with the snow. Not a train error, but I feel Boxer would have been able to make it to the lead locomotive by climbing down and standing on the plow at the front instead of trying to climb onto the hood. No ding, just sloppy technique. Later, when the train is switched to an out-of-use dead-end siding, it looks like something has already been travelling up and down the line as the tracks are clearly visible. When Manny misses his jump, he's dragged under the F unit for a moment, and I noticed two things. One, there's hardly any mechanical equipment in this shot under the locomotive, and two, he wouldn't get dragged under in the first place on account of the snowplow at the front. The inside of the lead engine's cab is coated in this black stuff, and I have no clue what it's supposed to be. Dirty ice, frozen hydraulic fluid, 43 gallons of emotional support Flex Seal that the driver keeps in the cab. I don't know, you tell me. Heading to the tunnel, some film crew are visible beside the tracks, but I choose to believe that these are actually train spotters who heard a runaway was coming and wanted to get a once-in-a-lifetime shot. Also, the train roars like a tiger as it crashes through the tunnel barricade. Climbing to the back of the locomotive, Manny uses a questionable technique to uncouple the engine from the others, and after the multiple unit cables separate, again, both engines should have shut down. Finally, the last error is how quickly the F unit slows down after being detached. The sound of brakes being applied can be heard, but that shouldn't happen since they burnt off so long ago, and as such the locomotives should have coasted for a little bit longer. With that, this runaway train finally comes to a stop, leaving us to watch our protagonist vanish into the fog as somber music plays and that deep Shakespearean quote appears. I really like this film. It works as both an enjoyable action movie and an actually layered story about a man's struggle for freedom in a world that would rather keep him in a cage. The writing, acting, and cinematography all come together to tell this surprisingly emotional story. The soundtrack is mostly simple 80s synth and bass, nothing to really write home about, but it's genuinely incredible how long it takes before the soundtrack kicks in, with the first 30 minutes of the film only containing diegetic sound, really bringing you into the harsh, unforgiving world of the story. The acting is hit or miss depending on the character. Jon Voight and Eric Roberts both deserve the award nominations they got for this movie, and John P. Ryan is terrific as Rankin. Rebecca De Mornay is also good, even if some of her dialogue is a little clunky. As for the rest of the cast, they mostly just spend the film overreacting, shouting, and sweating. The writing can be a little 80s at times.
The only person on the whole train is a woman. How lucky can I get?
But the dynamic between Voight and Roberts is more than enough to carry this film on its own. The railroad stuff is all shot really well, the models are on point when used, and old school practical stunts are always appreciated in this day and age. Most of the effects still look good, though it can be obvious when the footage is sped up, but considering its budget and the studio that made it, it's still pretty darn good. Avid train spotters will be pleased to hear that all but one of the engines that appeared in this film are still in service to this day, and you can find a list of their current numbers and whereabouts on the Wikipedia page for this movie. Big thanks again to the Normal Nut for providing additional information and helping me with pointing out errors. In terms of accuracy, I'd be willing to give this a 7, maybe 8 out of 10. While there's quite a few errors with the trains in this movie, it's more continuity issues than flat-out inaccuracies or breaking the laws of physics. The fact that the events of the story so strongly parallel the incident on the New York Central is enough for me to wave off the errors. Sure, these specific diesels would all shut off if just one multiple unit cable was severed, but not all diesels work like that, and so it's plausible enough that I can believe it, if you see the point I'm making. That being said though, if I have to watch one more film where a runaway train makes animal noises, is chased by a helicopter, and one of the lead characters is terrible with women, I swear to beaching I'm going to install Windows 11 on the computers of everyone involved in the process of making it. Merry Christmas, everyone!